This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the famous Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome once again, Buck.
My name is known all over the block.
You could probably have some fancy political slogans with Buck. I mean, is that correct? You could.
Well, the old one that we used back when we elected Dad Mayor was "I'm backing Buck."
I like that. So, that has a certain punch to it. Maybe you could bring it out of the closet and
maybe
you have some. Do you have some? Maybe some campaign stickers left.
There's still a few stickers left somewhere.
Why not recycle them?
Yes.
Well, on that note, just discussing the world, assuming that you found your way into the halls of power in Washington and became the vice president, if the fates were kind to you, obviously discussion would come up about the Middle East. All kinds of reasons and the complexities of what's going on. In general, when these discussions happen, people that are more knowledgeable, I have to say, than you and I attempt to make some comments about it. But it would appear that it would be reasonable to say something about what's happening there. I guess we could start with our national interest. What is our national interest in being in the Middle East and being so involved there? What do we get out of it, to ask that question?
Well, the first and I think most important answer is spelled oil.
Yes.
Because we are one of the biggest oil hogs on the planet, and I don't see that changing at any time. And a massive amount, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but a huge amount of the world's oil supply comes out of the Persian Gulf and through the Straits of Hormuz, and which is right in the very heart of the Middle East. It's now one of the great choke points of geostrategy. And I think that's one of the big reasons. And you can really trace in many ways the geostrategic importance of the Middle East in the modern era to a decision that Winston Churchill made a little bit over a century ago. I think it was around 1910, when he decided, when he was Lord of the Admiralty, that he was going to switch the British battle fleet over from being coal-powered to being oil-powered. Oil is liquid, it is easier to use and transfer and pump at sea. It's got about twice the calorie content of the same amount of coal. The only problem is that back before deep sea oil rigs were a thing, England had no oil. The oil was all in the Middle East. From there you get Lawrence of Arabia during World War I. Then the United States and the Arabian American Oil Company, as foreign oil becomes increasingly important to the United States. And I think all this gets driven home in 1973 when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries said, let's jack the prices because we have them where we want them.
So this might be an explanation for some of the, I guess, the jousting that's happened there. Well, okay, we have to protect the oil. If we don't do this, we'll have a cold, dark winter. Gasoline will become just unaffordable. Gasoline lines, all these terrible things will happen. Well, since those eras, I guess, we now have fracking. Allegedly, the U.S. is, it said, energy independent. Yes. Now, that might be a slight hyperbole. Nevertheless, it's not far from one. And if you throw in Canada and Mexico, really, North America is quite energy independent as far as needing petroleum. So that's making our, I guess, position in the Middle East a lot more secure. We don't have to really
superfluous, perhaps.
Yes, we could go there. And so who is it that does have an interest? We could make one more point, possibly. Point number one is that, well, we have a lot of fracking. Point number two is there are many, many sources of petroleum that are out there that are underutilized, that something could be done relatively quickly. And thirdly, There are efforts out there for using different kinds of non-carbon energy sources, wind power, solar energy. I mean,
And I'm a big one for that.
And there are even some, particularly in France, nuclear reactors are out there. Lots of ways to get power, so the dependence, it's fair to say, particularly for the U.S., has really substantially diminished, and with that, our interest in the area. I think that might be a fair statement. So it would appear the people that have the most interest in this might be possibly the Chinese, and possibly Western Europe, and there are a few other countries out there. But they seem, and they have no role, as far as we can tell, in being enmeshed much in the area. And would we want them to, is a second question.
Yeah, why should the Chinese do that when we're there trying to be the stabilizing influence on our nickel? But you're absolutely right. China is going to become a massive user of fossil fuels over the next 20 to 50 years. And so they're going to have an interest in it. So might we have an interest in perhaps denying that to them? You have Russia, of course, and Russia has always been trying to get its foot into the door with a warm water port, getting through the Black Sea and access to the Mediterranean, moving south into the Gulf of Oman, into the Indian Ocean. So those are big geostrategic concerns as well, which are secondary things that have kept us there. And also, of course, the support of Israel, which is
well, that's another matter. So we might go through the issue of, okay, so the petroleum issue, there's less of a reason to be there. That's point number one. Point number two would be the Israeli circumstances. So the U.S. has, I think it's fair to say, not always, but particularly over the past several decades, has really been the guarantor of the state of Israel. I mean, they've provided extraordinary amount of money, weapons, and the way the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is quite a strong one. And the question would be, if we have this relationship, how much control do we have over internal Israeli policies? So if we say, okay, we're going to be your guarantee, we give you a blank check here with certain limits. So you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And when we're going to try and be a peacemaker. That's our role as a peacemaker, not necessarily to ensure that every decision that you make we back, if I can phrase it that way. Yes. And so we're there for that reason. Are we, I guess, appropriate peacemakers right now? Traditionally, that would be the role. Okay, there are a lot of relationships between Israelis and Americans, particularly with evangelical community, the Old Testament, the New Testament, lots of relationships, and I think the justification has often been, well, the U.S. can be an honest broker, they can do this, they can do that, but has the situation changed with President Trump moving the American embassy to Jerusalem? Which apparently, I mean, doesn't seem such a big deal.
But apparently it's very incendiary.
But it's a huge, big deal.
Well, Jerusalem, and it would be a fascinating study to look into this, the extreme importance of the city of Jerusalem to three of the world's biggest, most important religions. And you can only really satisfy one of them, I'm afraid, if you come right down to it. So you have what's left of the temple. You've got what's left of it. You have the Dome of the Rock, which is there, and then you have all of the Christian
Stations of the Cross.
Yeah, what do you do with this? So I do think you're right. I think that that we can trust Israel, and I'm a supporter of Israel, but I think we can trust them because as a stable government, I think you consider them more or less a rational actor by Western standards. So we can kind of trust them not to go off half-cocked or go crazy or something, and that they will, they know that we're a good friend to them, and so they're always going to keep an eye on American public opinion and not exceed their brief. So I think the greater issue is, why do we need to be the guarantor of any foreign country, anywhere? That I think you can take this back at least to Woodrow Wilson and the idea of exporting, the 14 points, exporting the American way of life and doing exactly what our greatest Secretary of State said that we shouldn't do. We should not go abroad in search of monsters to slay.
And who was our greatest secretary?
It was Johnson Quincy Adams. Did I not say that? So it was, yes.
Okay, I got to think about that. All right, well, great.
Well, come up with somebody who was more successful. I would say that perhaps his biggest competitor would be Charles Francis Adams.
Yes, so the Adams are in there.
Yes, who managed almost single-handedly to keep England out of the war on the side of the Confederacy about 50 years later.
Well, let's just, I mean, I think you've broached an issue. So we're making a list of things. Okay, we have petroleum, we have Israel. A third thing might be the sort of messianic desire of America to make the world not only safe for democracy, but actually be a democracy.
Well, that's what I was talking about with Wilson.
Right, and just to continue along those lines, yes. So the idea is that the sort of fundamentalist religious Christian idea of missionary zeal that maybe was more in evidence in earlier generations. The idea is send missionaries to China. We're going to have Christian missionaries are going here and there. They come back and talk. That, in many ways, that missionary zeal has been transmitted to the idea of democracy as being a religion.
Yes.
And the idea is that, and simply said, is all across the world, these terrible events are taking place, just horrible things, brutal murders, killing, torture, people ground into dust because of the absence of democracy. And just as soon as the light of democracy appears and all of the bad guys are cast down, then there'll be this great world utopia. And it's
broad sunlit uplands.
That's right. Yes.
That's one of your favorite quotations.
Yes, it
from
is.
Churchill.
You're right. And so this great, wonderful situation will occur. And all the U.S. has to do in exercising its power is to cast out the dictators, the malefactors that are injuring people. Just as soon as the devils are gone, everything will be great. And so the U.S. and in the Middle East has tried to take out dictators, tyrants, and when that happens, the thought would be, well, the grateful populace that we've done these things for are just going to rejoice, and it'll be a wonderful situation. So I think particularly in Iraq, the idea of going in there, Saddam Hussein was this terrible person, and that the U.S. could go in and basically take the guy out, then there'd just be a wonderful situation would occur. And if you can remember when the U.S. Troopers went into Baghdad, there was an enormous statue was pulled down, just sort of the same way that in New York City, the statue of King George III was tossed down after the revolution. Okay, the statue was tossed down, rejoicing, and the people that were rejoicing were in many ways the Shias, whom he had run over and done terrible things to. And now those same people are demanding that we leave. And so you could say that certainly did not happen. And that should be a salutary experience for us. So our political system may not be easily transmitted everywhere. And you could also make the case that if you have a terrible tyrant, whatever, just an awful person, sometimes that might, in some circumstances, the best situation for that particular place and time. Not to say that we would approve of this, and we'd hope that from an evolutionary point of view, things would get better. But that could be one of the things that we've done there, is to cast out tyrants or a democratic process.
Well, a lot of what you say is true, but Americans are very naive when it comes to that. We want everybody else in the world to behave like Americans, and your talk about, well, if we could just bring them democracy, everything will be fine. That's the classic Wilsonian statement. If you remember the Weimar Empire, or Weimar Republic, we put together this wonderful constitution, or helped put together this one. and it just wasn't suitable
Right.
to that situation. Also, when we talk about overthrowing the dictators, and this is where our naivete comes in, we have certainly backed a lot of dictators as
My
well.
second point. Oh, you beat me to it.
I finally saw one of your traps.
No, I was going to see if I could get you into that box. And
But yeah,
Close
there's
it.
Batista and Nodin Jim and the Shah, in
particularly, which we
79,
can
and
discuss.
yes.
So the contrary thing about this is that, okay, we had Iraq right next door. Okay, so we cast down, for at least one of the reasons we did this was this is a terrible person, killing everybody and bad person. And then next door, the Shah
Yes.
was in power. And for geopolitical reasons, it's been a common story. So we have this sort of schizophrenic character in a way. So many times we could say, well, we want to support, democracy, let the light in, let be free. And then other times, there's a dictator there, we support the dictator with the idea that's going to be, firstly, people are unaware of many, they just, oh, there's a dictator there, is that right? I don't know. So particularly with the Shah, if you go through this, and I'm going to tell a Shah story or two.
Please do.
So the Shah was really well, in many ways a bad guy. So he killed people, he did this, he did that. He was a very corrupt person. And he was put in as, it was a client state that Iran was. He was put in by our intelligence agencies, by national will, and the idea was to take the Russians out. So Iran is a very strategic place, and the CIA was watching things carefully. In 1953, there was almost a coup. And nationalist people in Iran expropriated the oil wells, which are Western property. And so the American intelligence agencies constructed a coup that basically put the Shah in. So the Shah did all these bad things. And I've got one personal story about this. I guess I could share over the television. Just discussing the Shah. Many years ago, I was in London as a medical student, and I was at a party. It's a rather nice party, and an attractive young lady came up to me. This is my bachelor days. I had a certain interest in.
Not a honey trap.
Well, I don't know. It came up to me and started the conversation, and she said, "You must be an American." And I said, "How did you know that?" "Well, your shoes. You have American shoes." "Well, okay." So we had a very nice 10-minute conversation. And then suddenly, out of the blue, this lady started to scream at me, and the whole party stopped, and "You're a horrible American." This went on. I was dumbfounded.
So you had a good conversation
for
a
10
while,
minutes, and then
all of a
suddenly
sudden,
this volcanic eruption against, not so much against me, but against America. This went on for a long time. The party stopped, and then she left, and I was just dumbfounded as to what happened. And then an Iranian student came up to me, and he said, "You must wonder what's happened here." And I, "Yeah, sure, what happened?" And he said, this lady was a well-known agent provocateur of the Shah's secret police. And about 10% of the students overseas are in this secret police. And if we'd said she wanted us to attack America, if we'd said that, and when we went home back to Iran, the secret police would get us, they'd get our families to be tossed in prison. So they were basically living in this police state. It was a bad situation that was supported by the American government for geopolitical reasons. Number one, access to the oil, and then number two, having the country signed up in our security alliance against Russia. So we had a big security alliance that blocked Russia from going into the Indian Ocean, as you mentioned.
Yes.
So some
A
of
continuation
what,
of the great game.
Looking,
yes.
all right, so looking at the Middle East, you could say we discussed the political arrangements there. So we've influenced things in some ways in a schizophrenic way, basically to comport with our national will.
Yes.
So we might try and control the country for our own purposes, or we might cast down people, do all kinds of things, but not so much with understanding the complexities of that arrangement in that part of the world. All right, so that could be, I guess we could say, number 1, 2, 3 in our situation there. And I guess number 4 might be what happens if you get into a situation where somehow American soldiers, the flag is flying and the flag is despoiled by some bad people, and the idea is, well, we're going to flex our muscle and show people they can't do that to our flag. And that seems to play a role in these circumstances. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think so, and I hate to keep coming back to Wilson, but he just seems to be the model of everything that's bad about our idealistic side of our foreign policy. And when the Lusitania was torpedoed in 1915, and this was really the September 11th of the early 20th century. The German destruction of a civilian passenger liner, 1,500 men, women, and children killed, 100 of them American, and it was just a shock to the Allies, to really everybody in Europe. It didn't help German PR at all that they celebrated it, the destruction in a grisly fashion. But people were goading Wilson to fight. Theodore Roosevelt said, former President Theodore Roosevelt said, "Turn me loose, I'll raise a regiment, I'll go over there." And Wilson responded, "There is such a thing as a nation being too proud to fight."
Yes.
There's such a thing as a nation that is so convinced of its own rightness that it doesn't have to prove that.
Right.
And he caught heck for taking that view.
Right.
I think in that one, I am a strong critic of Wilson, but I think in that regard, there was some degree of correctness that those people on that ship, the neutrals, the Americans on that ship, knew they were running a risk. They had been warned by the Germans, don't do this. And so are we to be held hostage over the fate of 100 people who blatantly ignored the realities of the situation? I don't know.
Well, I mean, just going through some more of these issues here. So, I mean, recently, I don't know, an American, I guess, professional, I guess, soldier is the wrong word, a hired contractor was killed as an American citizen, a hired contractor. Okay, and then to respond to that, there's going to be all this catastrophic story. And then if this doesn't happen, then the enemies are going to say, or they're going to say, do this and do that. So in some ways, American foreign policy becomes a volleyball going back and forth between our competing political parties. So if one party says, well, this president or person allowed this person to be killed and didn't do anything about it, okay, and then it goes back and forth. So they try and force the other side into some kind of really draconian action. So in a way, the Democrats, by attacking Trump recently, they're trying to, in some ways, force the guy into extreme action just because of his personality issues and unfortunate turn of events. But so that seems to be another card in the deck that's influencing the policy of what we're up to here.
Yes, and of course that raises the fallacy of the idea that politics stops at the coastline. I'm not sure if that's ever been the case. I don't know where that phrase originated. I don't know if that ever could be the case, but I certainly have never seen that. I mean, perhaps Pearl Harbor, perhaps September 11th to a degree, but here we are less than 20 years after September 11th, and we're still just as divided as we ever were in foreign policy. One of the things that particularly incensed me is that during Gulf War II, the Democrats in Congress every day who had an issue with this would stand up and read the names of servicemen who had been killed.
Yes.
Well, they wanted to put President Bush on the spot, and perhaps he should have been put on the spot. I don't disagree with that. But if they really wanted to do that, they should have voted to cut off appropriations, or simply, as a
Right.
negative veto, refuse to appropriate more money.
Right.
But they didn't want to do that. They wanted
Yes.
to use dead servicemen to score points off the Republican Party,
right.
and that was unconscionable.
Yes.
So, what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, there's certainly many difficult arrangements. Now, I'm going to now expand your question and say, what is the difficult situation that exists in the Middle East that's not commonly discussed? And so I would say point number one, looking at the Iran situation. Firstly, an incredibly ancient country, a powerful country that was in many ways co-equal with the Roman Empire. And so when the Roman Empire, in fact, you could make the case that a 4th century war between the Roman Empire and Iran exhausted the treasury of Rome.
Yes.
They didn't have enough money to resist the barbarians. Many things.
You can go back before that. Go back to Xerxes and Darius. You could
Right,
say
right.
that the Persians were really the world's first true superpower.
Right, and you could also talk many stories about the great ancient place, Omer Khayyam, many things, culture, many stories, all kinds of issues. And then like many countries, it was swept up by Western power. And now it's sort of, through a complicated set of circumstances, which take too long to get into, they now have a theocracy. And you could say, all right, there's this theocracy, this ancient country, this theocracy, what's going on? How's that country going to act? They have all these complexities with the Iranian situation. Probably one of the biggest ones is there's preponderant Shia country, which is a Muslim minority. It's a very intense tension between the Shias and the Sunnis, which might be the number one thing to consider in any kind of U.S. Arrangement in the Middle East. That's as far as I know, the number one card. There are other cards, and maybe I'm misstating it, but it appears to me there's this huge, long-standing, 1,000-year war between these two Islamic groups. It would be like Northern Ireland on steroids, or triple steroids.
Yes.
I mean, the tensions that both Islamic people that have their viewpoints that cause this terrible friction, terrible fighting, a Shia country right in the middle that's also a Indo-European country. So the language issues are different. There's ethnicity differences. There's quite a difference between the Iranians and everybody else there. And these terrible tensions exist, and it would appear that one of the things going on is the Iranians, the theocracies, attempting to extend their borders to the Mediterranean Sea. They're attempting to do that. They're trying to push the border of their co-religious, I guess, brothers in Syria and in Iraq and in Lebanon to have sort of one great brotherhood, and they're colliding with the Ba'ath Party. They're colliding with particularly the Sunnis. And so this terrible civil war, religious war, is raging. And for us to be in the middle of it is a fool's errand. There's no way that we can back the appropriate side. An interesting event is that when the Islamic State arose, they're pushing in different directions. Our allies in this were the Shias, and the general that we killed was on our side fighting the Islamic State there. Then he went against us because we stood in the way of this dream of going to the Mediterranean.
A classic example of that be Osama bin Laden, who was giving the Soviets grief for many years before he turned against us. And I'm sure we would have been happy about that at the time, and see how that turned out.
Well, once again, Bucky, a delightful conversation.
Thank you
for
This
coming.
program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.